All right, so I'm pinch hitting this morning, but I'm not worried about it because we have 4 excellent panelists who are going to provide some great discussion on desired future conditions. We are here really to explore DFCs and ideas ranging from their intended goals, the extent to which those goals are being achieved, what is or should be being done to make them meaningful, and perspectives on the future of those desired future conditions. We've got some great panelists here. To my right is Vanessa Puig-Williams. She is the director of EDF's Texas Water Program. Prior to that, she was the executive director at the Trinity Edward Springs Protection Association and is an attorney who has also advised landowners. To her right is Billy Howe. He is the associate director of government affairs for the Texas Farm Bureau. He's been there since 1999, and before that was in the legislature, so he has seen it all and watched the whole DFC chapter unfold. To his right is Gary Westbrook, Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation Districts general manager. He's also been there for 20 years and represents GMA 12 and 8. He's a past president of TAGD. He's been here pretty much since the beginning with his district's formation.
I was the guy that, y'all remember in the Bible where Moses parts the Red Sea? I handed him his staff.
You're not that old. To his right is Dr. Bill Hutchison, registered professional engineer and geoscientist. He's been working in groundwater for even longer, 40 years.
They're all making me feel young, which
me
really
too, I know.
True anymore.
He currently works as an independent groundwater consultant. He works for many of you districts out there, and prior to that worked both for El Paso Water and the Texas Water Development Board. So welcome, panel. We are going to start with a look back, where we've been. And I want to start with you, Billy. If you could just talk a little bit about really what were the original goals in joint planning when it was first established?
Sure. Well, back then, what had happened was that actually you had a lot of new districts created in the 2001 legislative session. And actually, Buster Brown had held up allowing a lot of them to be created. And we had to go through a whole stakeholder process in the interim and basically pretty much with Greg and others rewrote Chapter 36 to a large extent. But that one criticism that was still always out there was that, okay, y'all want local control, but the groundwater doesn't start at the county line. So how are we going to make sure that we have some coordination between the groundwater districts? And obviously from a Farm Bureau policy standpoint, we want local control. We don't want state control. We darn sure don't want federal control. Clearly, our WOTUS lawsuits prove that. But and so we worked with several of the groundwater district managers that had been around for quite some time and went to Robbie Cook and asked Robbie, hey, will you put this in your bill? Because the big bill was actually dying in the House. I think it was Senate Bill 3 at that point. And that whole thing was just to get past that criticism about y'all want to regulate this locally, yet these aquifers aren't local. And that was really the whole purpose, was to actually really try to maintain local control of groundwater.
And then fast forward a few years, had some more conversations then in 2005 with House Bill 1763.
Well, 1763 was Robbie's bill that we put the DFCs on at that point. Then, yeah, I think it's been rewritten, twice after that? We went back and had negotiations through the TWCA process, right. And then again, when Alan Ritter was chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, it got revamped one more time. Yeah,
there's been 2 large bills that added to Chapter 36. You know, the neat thing about all this, when I handed Moses that staff, there were only like 55 pages in Chapter 36, and it's what, 200 now or something like that. But anyway, yeah. So the updates that came along later were the balancing language, which, if I remember right, we sat in your office and had several pretty good arguments about that language and what language would go in there and what those 9 factors would be. And I see several of the folks that were in those discussions out in the audience today.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to ask you about that, Vanessa, because that was in 2011, part of the Development Board's sunset review, I think, when those 9 factors were added in. Those 9 factors being the aquifer uses or conditions, hydrogeologic conditions, the water needs and strategies in the state water plan, environmental impacts, socioeconomic impacts, private property rights, feasibility of achieving the DFCs, and then the catch-all, any other relevant information. Those were incorporated. You know, from your perspective, you know, how did that help? Did it help things improve?
Well, I think we're still having the discussion, so we're getting there. There's more work to be done. A couple of things. I think those are the right factors. I mean, I think the legislature and really, I guess it was the Water Development Board that had those factors as rules, as part of a rulemaking in the petition process to determine sort of the reasonableness of a DFC. I think they're the right ones. I think they are kind of all-encompassing. I mean, looking at the science, looking at the impact to property rights, looking at the impacts to the environment. The problem is that we need more resources and data to really implement them effectively and to understand what the local impacts are. But one point I want to make, and I was not involved in these conversations back in 2011. I think I was busy having babies. But is that at the same time that these conversations were having about, and this was all taking place with the Sunset Bill, the budget was also in the works, and the legislature substantially reduced the Water Development Board's budget in 2011. So prior to that, the board had really provided a lot of technical assistance to groundwater districts and would run scenarios for them. And so then at the same time that the legislature is giving all these additional requirements to districts to go through the DFC process, it took away a lot of the support that the state was providing. Maybe some districts were okay with that, but I know others that, you know, without resources had to kind of look at, well, now we've got to do this on our own, and we don't have the funding to do that. Just really quickly, since Robert wasn't able to be here, I thought I'd read a quick quote from a paper that he had written kind of right after this happened, and he said that the groundwater availability modeling section was hit with about a 40% reduction in staffing, about a 50% reduction in modeling grants used to develop and improve models, and a nearly 60% reduction in its operating budget. Reductions at these levels have consequences for the services we provide. I don't know if Bill wants to like follow up on that, but I know that the board has kind of gotten back to a better place with that, but you know, our state is growing and our water resources are limited, so I think there's a lot more support that we could do there.
All right, Bill. Looks like you've got something you want to say.
Well,
And I'm not going to argue with Robert. He's not here.
well, the problem was you're reading something that I lived. Those were the folks on my staff that were let go. Yeah. As you said, the board provided technical assistance to what is a blended policy and technical process in the first round. There wasn't much statutory guidance on how to do that, so the board developed the rules associated with the petition process to kind of help guide the process. 11 came along. All the DFCs were adopted in 2010 in the first round. The legislature cut the budget. The internal board policies then slashed it all in groundwater. So now in 2011, there's additional requirements for explanatory reports, the 9 factors, and also no technical assistance. So the districts now had to go out and get their own help to do that work with more requirements on it. And yeah, it was different.
So just a little bit more on where we've been. Gary, you've you've been through this. In addition to just, obviously the statutory and process changes, what other changes have you seen over the past 20 years?
Gosh, what you were talking about was a great opportunity for me to learn, having conversations. A general manager used to be able to contact the Water Development Board, engage one of the modelers, and request models to be run. That's all that was required. You're a general manager of a groundwater district. And if you really want to see what I didn't know, go back and look at the ones that I had Shirley Wade run. Dr. Shirley Wade always will have my utmost respect for helping me to understand how models worked and all that. But so that transition was interesting, because you went from districts trying to understand, really what we were supposed to be doing, to trying to work together to come to an understanding as well. We were fortunate in that we had kind of decided, being ground zero for the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, and a lot of production already put into the models and predicted water to go from the area between Burleson and Lee County to Williamson County, all that stuff already in the plan and in the models. So we were already looking at how we wanted to manage, and we were already setting restrictions on impacts to aquifers. And so when the DFC language came along, it was very consistent with what we were trying to establish, but we had to find a way to meld that with our neighbors' management, and all of it, it just didn't quite fit hand in glove. So there was a lot of modifications. And so when you go through that process, it is really interesting, and it does get the districts working together, which I think was the whole intent. And we've seen efforts over the last, 20 years to find different ways to get districts on the same page. We've seen bills filed that had the Ogallala Aquifer Authority, dare I use that word. There's always that consolidation effort going on at the legislature, and so this was a way that we would work through the process to show that districts could work together and have common goals, and that's still a growing process. We're still growing through that process, and that's why the voting is set up the way it is.
Thanks for that, Gary. Billy, would be interested, from your perspective, what you would say are some of the lessons we've learned over the past 20 years in going through this process.
Oh, Lord.
We didn't know there was going to be a test.
Yeah, we didn't know there was going to be a test.
Stacey wrote the test, not me.
I don't know if it's so much my perspective as much as me just listening to people talk. After it was put in place, after we've gone through several rounds of it, it's interesting to me, working for a statewide organization, to hear the different perspectives on whether or not they think the process works or doesn't work, I think, to a large extent. And that's some of the things that we've talked about when we looked at sort of rewriting the statute to a certain extent was, how can you address some of those issues where people don't think that they're working? Is it a process where each district just kind of goes along with the other districts and everybody sort of sets their own DFCs and everybody just votes with everybody? I think that that's kind of one of the criticisms that's out there, is that maybe it's not a process where, they're really looking at it holistically and voting on a DFC that is holistic for the whole GMA. I've heard that before. But when you look at statute, I don't know how you change that. You've got a 2/3 vote right now. You can only set up a process, and then
Right.
The people that are involved in it have to make it work. And I think if there's anything, that maybe that's part of it. And then the issue with the counties that don't have districts.
Right.
And people are like, well, this GMA is telling us we can't use more than X amount of water. And I'm like, well, how's that? Because you don't have a district to tell somebody they can't drill a well and pump. So I'm not really sure how the GMA is telling you anything. But they're required to still set the DFC even for those counties that don't have a district.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll add to that, when we were going through everything back in 2011 with the Sunset Review, and there was a movement to try and include additional interests on the GMAs. And, you know, my concern with that always was the fact that you have everyone within those districts represented. In our particular interest, in our situation, we have a board of 10, and they have specific water interests that they represent. And so to add additional interest to the GMA would be to kind of water down what your groundwater districts are doing, and you have representation on your boards to your citizens. And that includes not just internal water use, but would also include individuals in my district that wanted to lease water and sell water and see water move. And so everyone had representation on our individual boards. So it was very much a concern to us that there was a movement to possibly add regional planning group representation on the GMAs when we were really dealing with property rights and trying to find the management strategies that would work and mold them into this DFC process. And so that was a very important thing, and it ended up working the other way around. So,
And can I just
Yeah,
add
go
one
ahead.
thing I was going to say? I mean, obviously, the process was created to get districts to work together because groundwater is a shared resource. But it also, what I think was unique about it was that it tasked districts to look at what do you want your aquifer to look like in the future? What is our desired future for this aquifer? And so while I think the holistic viewpoint is important, you know, we all know that aquifers are different, and even within a groundwater district, an aquifer can behave differently. And so it's those local impacts and the desire for what a local community may want to see that aquifer look like that, you know, we need to begin paying more attention to.
Well, and maybe that's a good segue into where we are. And so I was going to turn to Bill because we're
Yeah, Gary just mentioned it. What is a DFC? A DFC is the desired future condition. It's what things are going to look like in 50, 60 years. But the other part of this, and I understand the holistic view of what it's going to look like, and this all sounds pretty and unicorns, but at a practical level, this is about groundwater availability. Go back to prior to 2005. Regional planning groups set the groundwater availability and put it in the plan. There were no guardrails. They could make up anything they wanted. They didn't have to document anything. The one thing this process has done is it creates a situation where you have to actually document how that groundwater availability gets calculated or gets set. And that's an important part of the overall planning process. It's an important part of how one district deals with a neighboring district. And it's very important as a planning process to recognize that a lot of it's about water availability.
So Bill, you brought up the water availability. So if you can imagine right now, the districts set the DFCs, and then the Water Development Board uses that information to run the GAM, groundwater availability model, to give back the MAG an estimate of what many people would compare to permitting, so that you know kind of where you are. But you're right. Prior to that, the regional plan would call for a certain amount of groundwater to be made available. And the language in statute was that a groundwater conservation district's management plan could not be inconsistent with the regional planning group's plans. And so it was like they were writing the checks and we had to put the money in the bank.
It was a way for the districts, the local districts, to maintain control of that
To
process.
have representation.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, then we also had the situation prior to 2011 where there weren't really any guidelines on how to set a DFC. And a DFC was set that was, Ron remembers this one, that was inconsistent with the amount of exempt pumping that was going to happen. And there was a petition filed, and we got into what the regional plan had put in, and they had a number that was even worse, that was actually inconsistent with their narrative. And so this whole process has sort of brought us down to the point where we have to document things better. We have to be internally consistent. And a lot of that revolves around models, and they're improving, and we'll talk about that later. But, you know, this is basically taking something that started off 25 years ago was sort of a make up a number, and now we actually have to document what it means.
Well, and that was actually where I wanted to go next, because we have used up a little bit more of our where we've been time, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about where we should be going. Could you just speak a little bit more, Bill, on the models and how they've improved?
Sure. The models, the GAM program started around 1999 or 2000. The DFC process didn't start until 2005. So consequently, models were put into service that were not designed for that process. And we quickly found some problems with that and have been catching up ever since. The one example I like to use is GMA 13, the Southern Carrizo-Wilcox. That model was developed in 2003, 2004, and we've been using that model ever since. The one thing and GMA 13 wanted to have a DFC that was focused on the outcrop area. Well, the model was completely unable to deal with that in any kind of meaningful way. So we've been able to work through that with the limitations of the model. Now the new models that are being developed since around 2012 have actually been designed specifically with the DFC, the joint planning process, in mind, which makes them much more suitable tools to deal with the issues that are in each GMA. And they're different across, different GMAs have different issues. And so we want to make sure the models are improved, not only from a data standpoint and a calibration standpoint, but also from an objective standpoint to make sure that they're suitable for the use of the GMAs.
And everybody, just so you'll know, I need to understand things at a little more simple level. Anybody that knows me already knows that. So if you're talking about a groundwater availability model, please understand, if you're used to using an Excel spreadsheet, then imagine that as a three-dimensional spreadsheet, one layer on top of another, and the thicknesses of the layers matter. They correspond to the thicknesses of the formations. But each one of those cells has a formula in it that includes an amount of water in storage and how fast water moves through it. And so whatever you do in that cell affects the cells around it, and they affect the cells around them, and so forth, whether it's production, pulling from cells, or recharge going into cells. And it's just a bunch of mathematical equations, and so you run it forward to see what impacts that you see. And that's what a groundwater availability model does. And it's very helpful now. It wasn't in the origins, because the origin of those GAMs was simply to use for regional planning, to go out and say, hey, if we're going to need X number of acre feet of water in this region, here's where we're going to go get it out of this aquifer. We'll run a general model run and say, okay, this 5-county area comes up with 200,000 acre feet a year. We'll use that to balance the needs for the state. So it's been quite an evolution.
Thanks, Gary. And talking about the science, and then there's the policy and the 9 factors, and you already alluded to this, Vanessa, but Billy, I wanted to ask you about the 9 factors. Do you think they're the right factors? Do they need to be refined after all these years of utilizing and applying them?
No, I think they've held up well. I mean, I think whenever you look at what the DFC purpose is and what regulatory authority that groundwater districts have, if you're going to sort of use the DFC as your reasoning for doing certain things at the district level, you need to make sure that you've addressed those factors to be able to justify what you did. And I mean, I think they've held up well. I don't know, really, off the top of my head, I can't think of something else that would be added or taken away from it, personally.
Vanessa, do you have anything on that?
Well, I mean, I think, as I said before, they're the right factors, but I just want to back up for a second, because if we're talking about where we are now, 95% of the DFCs across the state allow for some amount of drawdown. And so the question is, well, what does that mean to people in the communities? What does that mean to our rivers? What does that mean to our springs? It's really hard to quantify that. And I think that's where I'm sensing a lot of frustration from landowners, is that they don't understand, like, it's hard to understand what the DFC process is, how to engage with it, but they don't understand how these DFCs that allow this, regional drawdown over the next 50 years are going to protect their interests and protect the the resources that they're enjoying, like Jacob's Well or other springs. And so I think it really comes down to like how groundwater districts in the GMA and the joint planning process are meaningfully considering those 9 factors. They're the right ones, but how do we ensure that they're being meaningfully considered? And it comes down to, you know, having enough data, having the right tools, and some of those don't exist, and we don't have the resources at this point in time to create them. And so that's, I think, the issue.
Well, I think part of them being meaningful, I'm sorry, Bill, I think part of them being meaningful is, and this is one thing where you talked about, is it working or not? I mean, I think that there's a lack of public participation in the process that would probably make some of these things more meaningful if there was, because to a certain extent, it's only through the public participation that you're going to have accountability for what you're doing. And you can't make people engage in the process. You can't make them show up and disagree with what's being said at the meeting or whatever necessarily. So I think, and I don't know, I mean, you know, how do you get people to participate more unless it's like a hotbed issue that's showing up in the newspaper and so everybody shows up, Greg, right, at those. But that's not the norm, certainly across the state.
Yeah, Vanessa's point is a good one that we thought about in 2010. The DFC or the drawdown or whatever, as it, however it was expressed, there was nothing backing it up. What is 15 feet of drawdown? What does that mean? And that's where the explanatory report comes in. By adding the 9 factors and having an explanatory report where you have to go down each one of those and explain what happened. The one that's important for what you were just discussing is the hydrologic impacts. Mm-hmm. And at least in the ones I do, the 4 or 5 GMAs I work with, we include a water budget analysis of what that 15 feet of drawdown means in terms of what the impact is to spring flow, to river flow, that sort of thing. So what you're really talking about is, I try and use the explanatory report as an opportunity, on, at least on a regional basis, to do an impact analysis. What does this new pumping mean? What does this drawdown mean in the context of an overall water budget idea? So you're right to the point up to 2010, and that was one of the reasons we went in the explanatory report, at least the ones I work on, why we do things the way we do to answer those kinds of questions. So to the extent that there is public participation, we can at least explain it. We can't drag people in and say, here, come and listen. Different GMAs have different levels of participation. It just depends on the area of the state you're in. And that also highlights the fact that one size does not fit all. Every area is going to have different levels of interest, different issues to deal with, and we try and adopt that. You know, the factors, they're correct. The weight of the factors, that's a local decision and should be based on the conditions. And, you know, the complaining oftentimes is, you know, kind of boils down to we should do it all the same way everywhere. And that's not a good idea.
So, Gary, we're talking about the public participation, and you obviously have seen your public engaged in the DFC process. Do you want to add anything to this conversation about that?
Well, sure. The hard part is to get folks to understand. I mean, you can publish drawdown maps and all of that for 15 years, but until there's actually an impact that someone feels, you don't hear about it. And so that's when some of that participation begins to take place. That's one of the hard things, is how do you get folks to understand? I mean, these are normal folks. They go to work, they come home, they've got normal lives, and you want them to understand hydrology. Well, good luck. And so trying to get that information across to them in such a way that it makes sense so that they come and participate and so that they do understand what's coming is a challenge. And we've seen that in GMA 12. You know, the Vista Ridge project came online. We've had some folks, if you were engaged in the last interim and during the last session, a lot of discussion, rightfully so. You know, we've dealt with this and we've grown through it, but the intent was always that everybody would understand as we published all these maps. And that kind of leads back to what Bill was talking, one size doesn't fit all. Most GMAs, their idea of socioeconomic impact is to go look at the regional water plan and bring that information in from the regional planning group's socioeconomic impact studies, mainly because of expenses. But now we're starting to see, because of this situation that we have in GMA 12, we're starting to see more of a balanced look at socioeconomic impacts. What are the socioeconomic impacts to the state for not having water? What are the socioeconomic impacts locally that landowners with wells are experiencing, and how does that add up? And so how does that balance take place? That's just one of the 9 factors. So.
And that impacts, those considerations impact groundwater availability ultimately. So, to your point, Bill, about the DFC process is, how we determine groundwater availability. I just want to emphasize that that's connected to the regional and state water planning process. And, so it's the DFCs that are defining available groundwater for that process. And if we don't get the, true considerations, looking at like all the different perspectives, like you were just mentioning, for example, with socioeconomic, then I think we run the risk of kind of overestimating groundwater availability, and that's a risk for in-water planning.
So I want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about once a DFC is set. Chapter 36 talks about achieving the DFC. This last session, there was a bill that was filed, House Bill 4891, and it dealt with monitoring and tracking the achievement of DFCs. Gary, do you feel like legislation like that is necessary based on your experience?
Necessary? I'm not sure whether the folks up there that do all those things are worried about what I think is necessary. I can tell you that bill's not going to go away. It's going to come back. There's too much pressure on groundwater in this state for folks not to do as much of an evaluation as possible. And as a groundwater conservation district, if you don't have some methodology that you're following, something that's well-defined, that the public can look at and see that you are managing to the DFC, then you're going to come under scrutiny in the near future. Those bills are not going to stop being filed. They will continue to be filed. There's too much pressure on groundwater. There's too much interest. There's too many folks that are affected one way or the other, either not having enough or being impacted because of withdrawals. And so having a robust monitoring network, having a way to evaluate those impacts and prove whether or not you are compliant with your management plan in achieving those DFCs, the pressure is just going to continue to mount, in my opinion, on that.
Billy, do you have anything to add on that?
No.
All right, then. I'll let you off the hook on that one. I know, Bill, I'm going to,
yeah.
absolutely.
The thing that, when that bill came out, you sort of got this sense that no one had ever done this before. It was all being, they all thought it was something new. Well, in fact, I work with, half a dozen districts where we do this routinely. One GMA, we do it routinely. And it's a way to, and even back in 2013, I spent the first several months of work with GMA 13 doing that work, doing precisely that, trying to track how this all fits together. And it's amazing that the Water Development Board has a very good groundwater database. There's a lot of data out there that you can use and leverage to figure out how are you doing, how consistent are you with the DFCs. It's not rocket science. It's very, it's very straightforward. You use the Water Development Board's database, use the model output, you do a comparison. And it's something we do routinely. Now, maybe that's not what the intent of the bill was, but my plan is, knowing that bill is going to come back, is all the GMAs I work with, we're going to start doing that, so at least there's a template out there of what has been done up to this point.
Well, and I think to that is that consistency, ensuring that it's being done, that there's a system in place, that it's being documented in a way that it's available perhaps to the public to see how things are going. With that, Bill. Vanessa, did you have something you wanted to add on that?
I was just going to add, I think another way that I think could help groundwater districts measure achievement with the DFCs is by looking at DFCs that are more localized. So maybe within a management zone or, around a particular spring, you have a more defined area. And so I know right now most of our DFCs are kind of like regional based, but it doesn't mean that they can't kind of be brought down a bit to help both with the kind of achievement and measurement of them.
I don't think it's necessarily a big deal to come up with some way to determine whether or not or to monitor whether or not DFCs are being accomplished or not. The question is, what do you do next? I mean, if they aren't, or you don't think that they are, what's the recourse? That would be the part, exactly. We got the current petition process, which that's a whole nother panel, whole nother discussion.
Well, I mean,
But to a large extent,
management
yeah.
changes too.
But I mean, so it's basically like it's peer enforced, right? To a large extent. I mean, you can have a person that has some defined property right that can file a petition and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, really, that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. It's not about figuring out how to monitor whether or not somebody's achieving the DFC or not. People have enough information out there today to actually do that. So, I mean, it's kind of like what's the end game in wanting to do that? And when we were looking at the bill last session, I mean, those were the questions we were asking. And we actually didn't engage on the bill and didn't take a position on it one way or the other. But, I mean, that's kind of what we talked about within Farm Bureau, but not with it, even outside of Farm Bureau within Texas Ag Council, was, okay, what's the next step once they get all this put together?
Well, Billy, and actually you went right where I was about to go, and I was going to ask Gary, okay, so let's say that, how does this translate into management? What happens if you're monitoring and you're tracking and lo and behold, we're not going to achieve, or we're going to bust the DFC?
Well, you need to have rules in place. That one of the discussions in the pre-meeting is DFC planning or regulatory. We believe it's some planning, but very regulatory. If you're required to put these in your management plan and then adopt rules that implement your management plan. So that's the key. And we've had a couple of petitions filed against us with the accusation of not protecting the water in the region, and TCEQ has seen fit each of 3 times to say, no, they're doing their job, they're following their rules. But that's the key, is do your rules actually provide management to achieve the DFC but not exceed it? And so you may have thresholds and adjustments and permitting, things like that. That are necessary to put in there. It depends on what your DFC is. We didn't talk about the fact that some of these desired future conditions aren't drawdown, they're spring flow, maintenance of spring flow. Just depends on where you're at. But it's important to have it in your rules.
And you fall into the trap, Gary, of assuming that if you did this comparison and the data showed that you're below the DFC, that somehow you have to put in some restriction. Well, you also have to take into account maybe the model's not right. Maybe the model did not incorporate an assumption of future pumping correctly, and that becomes then a correction. So it actually works both ways. The comparison then gives you the opportunity to see, are you doing things management-wise, but it also is a post audit on the model to help improve the models in this. So, you can't just jump to the conclusion.
No, and in fact, in our rules, we actually have that caveat in there, is you're going to do the evaluation to see whether the model has been calibrated properly.
In the one that I do for GMA 14, we found a couple of instances where the assumptions in the model were just outrageously wrong. And so then it was just a matter of, oh, okay, that's good to know. We'll fix that in the next round.
Except that, I think one criticism that was brought up a lot this past session is that, the DFC just, in that way becomes this movable goalpost that you constantly are adjusting. And I think a lot of people think, well, no, it's supposed to be a goal. It's, we've brought together all the stakeholders and looking at all these considerations, policy and science, for what we really want this aquifer to look like, what it will provide for our community. And, at some point you have to stop pumping, and that is not going to be easy, but that's going to require, you know, all sorts of management tools that Gary just mentioned. So
You know,
Well, it's funny.
moving,
So this
the moving,
panel could have moderated themselves, obviously, or at least they could have filled.
We're
this
just
time
getting
with
warmed up.
Yeah, you guys just want to make me sit up here one more time. This was exactly what I wanted to talk about next. Was this criticism that is often made to the DFC process about the moving of the goalposts. So I just want to give everyone an opportunity, and I would like to go down the line and maybe let you speak to it next, Billy.
I mean, yeah, the Gold Coast can be moved, but I guess the deal is, are they being moved for the right reasons? I mean that's the whole thing, and I don't know how you necessarily make sure they're being moved for the right reasons, other than people engaging in the process to challenge why they're being moved. I mean, that's the only way you can really do it. But I mean, you've got to have flexibility in the process, because like Bill said, if the model shows that the model's wrong, or if you've got something else that's happening in that area and it needs to be changed, you got to have the flexibility to be able to change it. So,
Gary?
Yeah, so for us, we just went through a complete overhaul of the Central Carrizo-Wilcox GAM. And once we updated that GAM and incorporated all the more accurate information, calibrations and so forth, we realized that one of the DFCs we had adopted for the Carrizo Aquifer, we could turn off all of our pumping and it would still be exceeded. So that goalpost was going to get moved one way or the other. We didn't necessarily like that, but at the same time, it became a necessity. And so through evaluations, we came up with the goals that we would like to see achieved. And then through the voting process of GMA 12, those were established a little differently. But that was a process that had to go to the full extent that it went, because of updates to the model, better science. And so the model proved that it was useful.
I mean, who knew Samsung was going to come into Taylor?
Well, that's not even in.
I mean, you
the,
know,
the
but I'm just
current
saying. I
water
mean,
plan.
that's an example of
Yeah.
something that can happen. I mean, you know, we're out there actively trying to get big companies to locate the state of Texas. We got all these people moving in the state of Texas. Okay, when I moved to Austin in 1993, I never thought it looked like it looks now. There's no way. My son says it's getting ruined, but you know, he's only 22, and he's like, this isn't the Austin I grew up in. Like,
Well,
no, it's not.
And all you hear about is, oh, we need another 100,000 acre feet of water, as if we're going to run down to Walmart and get it. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. So,
All right, Bill, it's your turn.
okay, moving goalposts. You're right. Why are they being moved? It's easy to throw rocks at it. Oh, it doesn't mean anything because we're moving the goalposts. But you provided an example on GMA 11 or GMA 12. We also did in GMA 11, where when the model was updated, it provided additional insights, and it resulted in big reductions in the pumping, because the old model had a serious problem that was basically exposed when we updated it. And so the whole thing was redone, and we set up a sustainable pumping kind of regime based on the current network of wells, redid the DFCs, that redid the mags. The mags were lower. We alerted the regional planning folks that this was happening. So is it moving the goalposts, or is it an update in the technical ability to answer these kinds of questions? Now, fundamentally, nothing changed. The concept, qualitative concept of how they wanted to manage groundwater had not changed, just some of the quantitative numbers based on the most updated information and data.
and we saw
So-
the same thing in the Simsboro worked the other way with the updated
Right.
model. The impacts went down and the availability went up.
Right. So, you know, it's like anything else. If you don't like the results, criticize the process. If you don't like the process, then, you know, criticize the tools. I mean, it's the same old thing. So I think realistically, I don't think anybody has magically changed their philosophy or their ultimate qualitative goals. Some of the stuff needs refining. We get better information, we get better data, but nothing has, you know, there hasn't been any earthquake change in any one GMA as far as how things are going to be managed.
Yeah. All right, so another perfect segue. Thank you for that, Bill. I want to turn now with our last couple of minutes here to where we need to go or should be going, and talk about some potential changes or improvements to the process or to the that you might like to see. And one of them I had on my list for y'all to discuss is the science, obviously. And maybe Vanessa, I'll have you take that first.
Yeah, I mean, I worked last session on some efforts to get more funding for the Water Development Board to, increase their ability to work with districts to develop modeling and data. And I think that we need to continue to pursue that. I think the board's budget's still rather small when it comes to groundwater science, and that only will help districts, navigate this DFC process. I think we need a grant program at the board that districts can apply to so they can actually have some funding to do more local data and science so that we can, better inform all those 9 considerations.
Similar to regional planning.
Yeah, I mean, that's also something that's been brought up too is should the desired future condition process be funded similar to how the regional water planning process is? I mean, we've just talked about how it's connected to regional water planning, and we're putting all of this, burden on districts to go through this process of determining groundwater availability. So why not provide them with some support? I know there's always been concern, well, that might mean the state's going to come in and tell districts what to do. I don't think that's true. I think it's just going to kind of help to make the process run more efficiently and more sophisticated.
I agree with Vanessa. It's about the funding at the Water Development Board. I mean, if you want to have better science to be able to inform the DFCs and all of that, that's what you got to have. And I think one of the things that I've seen that's happened, I think that's made that an easier sell, is that we seem to have gotten past people's fears that the legislature was going to create an oversight mechanism at the Water Development Board over all the groundwater districts, because that used to be one of the biggest fears out there. And when Water Development Board went through that sunset process that time in 2011, even the sunset staff had actually made recommendations to put more oversights over groundwater districts because we had to oppose it. And we did a letter to the Sunset Commission telling them we were going to oppose that. But whenever they changed the Water Development Board to the 3 full-time folks, and those folks really got more focused on funding water projects, I think I felt like I saw a shift in that. And so I think, at least amongst my folks, there's more comfort with the role the Water Development Board currently has in the process now versus what they used to.
Gary, let's stick with the science and funding theme.
You want to stick with the science and funding. I think the board does need additional funding, and we testified and wrote some things from TAG on behalf of the board in hopes of that. And I think we made a lot of headway this year. Making the models the best that they can be really is part of the answer. Because if you're planning, you want to see what those impacts are going to look like so that you can understand within the context of evaluating those impacts with the 9 factors what that really means moving forward. And one of the things that we decided to do recently at GMA 12 was to go back to our individual boards and take those 9 factors 3 at a time and say, okay, what do you as a groundwater district believe these 3 factors mean in evaluating the DFC? And so then we're going to come back together and talk about those 3, and then we'll go back and try and hammer out a methodology that the GMA will use to consider our current DFCs and try to make sure that the public is included. Transparency is really important, and accountability. And so, but it would definitely help to have even better science no matter where you're at.
Well, and your district in GMA has invested in improving your GAM. There are a number of others that have done that and are doing that going forward. Bill, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, funding, it depends on who's getting funded and what it's being used for. Just throwing money at it is like throwing money at the education system. That doesn't always work. But in terms of the technical stuff, the models, one thing that we're seeing more and more with the development of the new codes is that it's a lot easier to dynamically link local scale models and regional scale models. And so I think what we're going to see over the next, like we saw the last 10 years, the improvement in the regional models, I kind of suspect over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more districts developing their own local scale models that are dynamically linked to the regional models, which will address some of the concerns that you hear about what are the impacts, because now we can get down to a district level impact. Those can be understood on a district level, but yet still be consistent and integrated in with the regional approach. One of the problems we've had over the last 20 years essentially is that folks want to use the regional models to do things on a local scale, and that's inappropriate. So I think we're going to finally start seeing that bridge gap where those local scale issues can be addressed in an integrated way, in a dynamic way with the regional model, and that will, I think, only help the joint planning process.
And you've got Bureau of Reclamation sitting out there in the hallway, and I know of at least a couple of instances in this state in the last couple of years that they've awarded grants for exactly what you just said. And groundwater surface water is probably the hardest bit of science to add.
I think the most important.
It is. It's very important to us. It's just so difficult to get all the information and get the partnerships that you need. The River Authority's willing, but then you got to find landowners. Anyway, but Burek, if you're a groundwater district and you want to do what Bill just talked about, go talk to them, because they'll walk you through the process and help you. So they're out in the hallway.
So we just have a few minutes left, and we've covered a lot of these topics, but I know all of you have more things that you want to say. So I'm just going to do something maybe a little bit dangerous and give you each a chance to provide, to the audience and share, kind of your closing thoughts on where do you think we should be going with DFCs. And yes, I will go opposite order this time and start down there with you, Bill.
Don't turn the joint planning process into something that it's not, or that it wasn't intended to be. And I think the districts working together has been a very good outcome of this. I think the explanatory reports, being able to document, that's a huge improvement over the past. It will continue to get better, like I said, with the modeling will continue to improve, and the local scale impacts will we'll be in better shape to understand those. So just don't turn it into something that it doesn't need to be.
Gary?
I'll just go back to my last comment, really. I think transparency and accountability, trying to do education so that people understand what the process is and what it actually yields, what it's designed to do, and to participate, to get folks in to participate. Billy brought up, there are some unprotected areas in each GMA, or in most of the GMAs. You've got a county or a part of a county that's not in a groundwater conservation district, and it really is difficult to get participation from those folks. So if you can do something to include them, that would be helpful. But it really boils down to accountability and transparency, education.
Billy?
I'll just go back to the science and better funding at the Water Development Board. I mean, I think that the process works the way it's currently in statute, but it doesn't work if you don't have the data to underpin the process. And that's very important. And so, I think that's probably one of the biggest things. So, I just think the whole community needs to come together and go to the legislature and all work together on trying to get that done. And, maybe I won't have a right to farm constitutional amendment to worry about next session, so I can actually focus on something else. But,
Focus
We
on
can,
water.
we can
oh,
team
by the
up
way,
on that
please
one.
vote for Prop 1. The right to farm.
1, and then what? 6 is
6.
and then yep. Okay, now Vanessa, your turn.
Okay. Last but not least, I agree with all of my panelists' comments, and I would just add that I think sustainability is something that's missing from the DFC process. Districts are required to, balance conservation with development, and they have to look at the what's called the total estimated recoverable storage of aquifer. That's complicated. We didn't really have time to discuss that, but there really isn't anything in the statute that requires them to consider what this sustainable yield or safe yield of that aquifer is. And I think that's important to long-term planning. So I'm not sure if we'll be pursuing that again this session. We maybe need to think about different ways about going at that since that bill hasn't been able to make it across the finish line. But I think that is important. And I guess just the last thing I would say is, you know, these factors that districts have to consider in the explanatory report, all that came about in 2011. And I think it's only been like 2 complete cycles that that districts have gone through in this process. And now we're starting the 3rd. So it is still relatively new. I think we are still figuring out like what's working and what isn't working. And so we'll continue to, I know we don't make it something that it isn't meant to be, but that doesn't mean that we can't improve upon it.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have time for exactly one question if there's one in the audience. Amy, it's you. If you wouldn't mind.
This question is for Vanessa. I think I understood you to say that you thought that there should be DFCs set to address local conditions such as Jacob's Well. I'm interested to hear why you think that should be addressed with regional oversight rather than local district rules.
Well, I think it's both, honestly. I don't think it's either or, but I think that because groundwater districts are required in statute to achieve the DFC, that if they have this goal to protect spring flow, it kind of gives them an added layer of support for those rules to do so.
All right, we're out of time. I want to thank our panelists for being here today, and also please keep Stacey Steinbach in your thoughts. She's, I'm sure, having a pretty awful day today with the death in the family. So, yeah, let's give these guys a round of applause.